Hey there guys, how's it going? Welcome back to my movie review series. So today we're going to be looking at another classic movie, and this is a review that I've wanted to do for quite some time. However, it took me a while to get around to rewatching the movie. It's been quite a while since I last seen it, and this is one of my personal favourite movies of all time. I think this movie is supremely underrated. I think it's tremendous. I think it's probably one of the best horror slash creature features of all time. It's one of my just personal favourite movies, and that is the movie Dog Soldiers from 2002, starring Kevin McKidd. Now, I remember hearing about this movie back when it came out. I was actually in primary school when this film came out, and I remember a friend of mine in primary school who I haven't seen in a long time telling me about this movie and recommending it to me, and sometime down the line, maybe a few years later, I came across it on TV because I wanted to get the movie. I can't remember whether or not my mum didn't let me have it or something like that, but I really wanted to see this movie, and at all turns I couldn't really get to see it, but then just a few years down the line it popped up on one of these horror channels on TV, and yeah, I finally got to see it, and I absolutely love this movie. I think this movie's badass. It's a movie basically about a brand of British soldiers who are out on a training exercise, preparing for real life in the field. Basically, they're a bunch of rookies. The leader of the soldiers, who's played by Pertwee, he's kind of a veteran soldier who's preparing the rest of these rookies for real life combat and whatnot. And they're on just a simple training exercise. They're out up in the Scottish Highlands, which I think was a perfect place to stage this movie. Like, I've always thought that the Highlands of Scotland is just the perfect location for a mystery type creature feature, because it's just so secluded. There's lots of mountains, there's lots of like uncharted areas, and there's lots of real just discreet, quiet locations, and the weather and the terrain is so harsh and so unforgiving and unpredictable to the point where you could easily get lost there. I think that was just the perfect setting for this movie, and it's interesting how they made this movie, because this movie had a very, very small budget considering the ambition of the project, because this is a movie that took something like 7 years to get made, because the director of this movie and the people involved had really, really high hopes for it, but they just couldn't find a studio or a investor to back the movie. So they had to cut a lot of corners, in the sense that what they did was they took a lot of aerial shots of the Highlands of Scotland, so you get a lot of real life images of the island, the Highlands, like the mountains and the forests and whatnot, whereas a lot of the actual scenes that they filmed were filmed on location in Luxembourg, because it was a lot cheaper to film in Luxembourg, and they found a lot of areas that look very, very similar to the areas that they'd been filming overhead by helicopter in the Highlands of Scotland. So they really did manage to find a way to work around the small budget that they had and make the movie as authentic as possible. And that basically brings me to my next point with this movie, and it's why this movie has always stood out to me as being one of my favourite horror films, and that is the authenticity of it. This is a movie where there's no CGI whatsoever. In fact, I think there's only one scene in the movie where they did add a digital insert, and that was when one of the characters has sort of a transformation and the eyes glow yellow, but that's only in one scene. You take that one scene aside, there is literally no CGI in this movie. It's an entirely practical and real movie in terms of all the effects that they use, like the makeup and the prosthetics and the costumes and the real life practical set pieces that are in this movie. The werewolves in this movie are probably, in my opinion, the most realistic and most terrifying werewolves that I've ever seen in a movie. I've always thought, when watching werewolf movies, they always seem to make the werewolves look either too wolf-like or too man-like, if you know what I mean. Like a werewolf, if you look at like werewolf mythology, they're supposed to be a hybrid between man and wolf. So if you look at the werewolves in this movie, they genuinely look like a hybrid. For example, they walk on two legs, they're very tall and very lanky, and they've got really unnaturally long arms and unnaturally long claws. And they have like wolf-shaped heads with big fangs and shit. So they really do genuinely look like a hybrid between man and wolf. And the costumes that they use and the prosthetics just look so real. It's a very gory film. There's a lot of practical, like real life gore. And it's funny, it's a movie that's really self-aware also, because the scenes in this movie where they use sort of the practical gore and realism of some of the stuff that's going on to great effect, and actually adds some comic relief. Like, for example, there's a scene in this movie where the Sarge gets slashed across his stomach by a werewolf's claw, and by this point we haven't seen the werewolves. You know, they sort of keep them in the background, and you get several POV shots of the werewolves, so at this point we don't know what they look like. We've only really seen them off screen, and a werewolf slashes the sergeant open, and basically his guts spill out. And even though his guts have spilled out, he's still perfectly conscious, and he's awake, and he's talking, and basically he's telling Kevin McKidd's character, who's sort of the second in command, he's telling him, get out of here, fuck off. Alright, that's an order. Like, telling him to run away to save his own life. And basically Kevin McKidd is like, no, I'm not leaving you behind, Sarge. And he's trying to get him and trying to bring him with him. And then he's just like, my guts are out. And he's like, we'll put them back in. And he's like, they won't fucking fit. Like, there's real some insane dialogue in this movie that you just couldn't make up stuff like that. There's a scene, for example, where they're trying to stitch up the sergeant after they get him to a safe location, and he just grabs a bottle of whiskey and starts downing it and tells Kevin McKidd to knock him out. Oh man, it's really funny. Like just the way that these characters act in these situations, and how overly emphasized all the dialogue is because of the pain and just the fear in these guys. It's really funny, and I think that the dialogue in this movie was really smart. Speaking of smart writing, I really love the way that this movie uses dialogue and banter between the characters in order to foreshadow certain events in the movie. And not only that, but in order to strengthen the relationship between both the characters and the audience. For example, there's a character in this movie who is obsessed with football. You know, that's kind of his character arc. He just loves football and he constantly goes on about it. And basically throughout the whole entirety of the movie, he just complains and moans constantly about the fact that he's missing the football, because there's a big game going on behind the scenes between England and Germany, and he's just so hyped for it, and he's like, I can't believe I'm missing it for this nonsense. And basically the other characters throughout the film keep telling him to shut up and stop moaning and shut up about the football. And it's just funny because he keeps going on and on about it, he keeps bringing it back up. And then later in the movie, when something happens to that character, they use that character arc, his love of football, to actually add some emotional weight to the scene. And I don't really want to spoil what happens and what's said, but it really works, and there's plenty of foreshadowing that's really good. And they even work in some humour at the very end of the movie in regards to that character arc. And there's a lot of things like that in this movie. You know, they use certain dialogue and like I said, certain character arcs to really make you care and relate to these characters. For example, there's another character who, unlike the rest of them, is just so stoic and just can't wait to get in there, basically. You know, he's talking about ancient British warriors who are cornered and outnumbered and just ready to fight to the death. And one of the other characters it's just like, you're loving this, aren't you? And it's quite funny, man, like just the way that he looks back at him and sort of implies what he's thinking. There's really smart and great dialogue like that really distinguishes these characters and who they are and how they differ from one another, and also how they relate to one another. You know, there's a scene in the early part of the movie where basically the sergeant, played by Sean Pertwee, is telling his men a story around the campfire, and it starts out as sort of a bit of a spooky story where he's talking about something that happened to one of his friends in the war. And I don't want to tell you like exactly what it is he says, but basically it foreshadows certain events in the movie, because he talks about how this sort of somewhat supernatural experience that he had in the army taught him to keep an open mind and always be prepared for what's out there, because you don't know what's possible. You know, and again, that kind of foreshadows that there are things in this world, unforeseen forces, that we don't understand. And it's interesting to me because there is a lot of foreshadowing in this movie for things that are maybe to come. Now, this movie never got a sequel, but it's interesting when you watch this movie in retrospect and listen to some of the dialogue, because there's a lot of dialogue like that. For example, there's a scene where one of the characters says, I mean, we know that werewolves are real. It makes you wonder what else is real, you know, and that kind of adds a little bit of intrigue and potential world building. And again, I just think that this movie is full of dialogue like that. It's full of excellent dialogue that was a lot smarter than it was given credit for at the time. And when the movie gets going, it really gets going. Like, as I was talking about earlier, how in the beginning of the movie, when it starts picking off characters, you don't actually see the werewolves at first. Like I said, it does that classic horror movie tactic of keeping them in the shadows and showing you POV shots, and just keeping you in suspense for what's to come. Like, you don't know how powerful these things are, how strong they are, like how tactful they are. You don't know what they are yet. You're not ultimately sure what it is that's attacking. But then as the movie starts to unfold, it becomes sort of a siege movie. The characters get to a particular location where they're held up in a house where the family of the house don't seem to be, you know, they don't seem to be anywhere in sight, so they decide to hold up at this house, and they start fighting off these werewolves who seem to be systematically attacking them. And as the movie goes on, you start to see more and more of the werewolves, to the point where towards the end of the movie you start to see them in full view with wide shots. And I gotta be honest, like I said earlier, the costumes and the prosthetics here and how real the werewolves look, it's genuinely terrifying. Like, this is a genuinely terrifying movie. Like, the werewolves in this movie just look so real. I mean, if they'd have done this movie nowadays, I have no doubt it would have been CGI, it would have been all computer animated, and it would have looked terrible and fake. But in this movie, it genuinely looks real. Like, I remember watching this for the first time and being like, whoa, that looks bloody real. It really does. I mean, there's one scene in particular where one of the characters, who's played by, I forget the actor's name who played him, but he's a former boxer, this guy. His name escapes me at the moment, but yeah, he takes on one of the werewolves in a kitchen. It basically breaks in and he starts stabbing fuck out of it because he's out of ammo. So he starts stabbing fuck out of it, and then he starts punching it and boxing it. And he's like, come on, let's have it. And he has a proper like barroom type brawl with this werewolf, and it's just coming at him slowly, and he's smashing plates over its head, and like I said, he's punching it and stabbing it and spitting at it and everything, and he just has a proper like fucking brawl with this werewolf, and it's a really like proper realistic scene. Again, I was watching that for the first time thinking that is badass, or how realistic they were able to make it look. There's another scene in the movie where, for example, one of the characters is in a car, and then one of the werewolves is just randomly sitting in the back seat, and he's like, oh shit. There's some funny dialogue too. For example, there's a scene where one of the characters is about to die. Like, he's been grabbed by one of the werewolves, and you just know it's going to eat him, and he just says to the werewolf, he's like, I hope I give you the shit. There's some really brilliant dialogue in this movie, man. It's really funny, and there's also some really sad, like heartbreaking moments. For example, I talk about things like foreshadowing. The sergeant early in the movie says to his men, because they're talking about what scares them the most, and he basically says, what scares me the most is never seeing my wife again. And then there's a scene later in the movie where he has to make a decision to sort of sacrifice himself in order to save his men, and you really get the sense early on that character loves and cares about his men, and just wants to see them out of there alive. That's all he cares about at this point. And I thought that the actor there did a fantastic job at portraying that type of character, and he was sort of a mentor to all these young lads who are just still rookies, and it was quite sad that there are some quite emotional scenes in the movie, particularly in regards to him. The guy who plays the lead role, Kevin McKidd, he's a Scottish actor. I think he did a great job. This was probably his best career-defining role, in my opinion. He did a great job as the lead role, and I would have liked to have seen him in more roles like this. I think he did a great job as sort of the action hero of the movie, and he's a very stoic character. He's a character that does what needs to be done, and in the very opening scene of the movie, you get a sense of how far he's not willing to go, because one of the characters asks him to do something completely unnecessary to him. However, it was foreshadowing what he would need to do later. Basically, a character tells him to do something and he says no, and he ends up in trouble because of it. Don't really want to spoil what it is, but yeah, that's the opening scene of the movie, and it just foreshadows what type of character he is, and it really makes him extremely likable. He's a very likable character and easy to root for. The ending of the movie was quite good too. I've seen a few people say that it's kind of anticlimactic. I don't think so. I actually think that the ending of the movie was pretty badass. It kind of goes out with a sort of a blaze of glory type of ending. I think it's a really, really intense and hyped up ending that I really did enjoy. You know, there's a good fight scene towards the end, and yeah, there's also a funny scene at the end where again they sort of reference back to the whole football thing, and it's quite funny, the very last moment of the movie. I just think this is a great movie, man. I really do. I've got no criticism of it. I give this movie a perfect 10 out of 10. Again, it's one of my favourite all-time movies, and I've got no criticisms of it at all. To say that it was done on a pretty small budget with a fairly troubled production, I think they made something special here. I think this is a genuine masterpiece, one of the most underrated horror movies of all time, and I think it's an absolute classic. So if you guys have never seen Dog Soldiers, I recommend you check it out, especially if you like creature features. You know, it's a really fun one of my favourite horror movies of all time, and it's a movie that's fairly short too. Like I said, it's only about, I don't know, it's only about an hour and a half long. It's not really a long movie, so it's not a movie that will take up a lot of your time, and it's a decent, fast-paced, really, really well-acted, well-written, well-made horror movie, and it's fantastic. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. I give this movie a 10 out of 10. Thanks for watching, and God bless.